a climate science and healing in a divided world. My name is Eric Miller. I am an associate professor of communication studies at Bloomsburg University, and I am here today representing the Bloomsburg chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby. I am joined tonight by my friend, colleague, and co-host Leah Zerby, who is here representing CCL Pottsville.
Thank you, Eric. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Citizens Climate Lobby, we are an international climate advocacy organization, and we have about 600 active chapters throughout the entire world. And 20 of those are right here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So drawing on what we call the 5 levers of political will, we lobby our congressional representatives, we publish letters and op-eds in local newspapers, we recruit and educate our friends and neighbors, build partnerships with civic organizations, and we meet regularly with our members to foster a sense of connection and community and action in response to climate change. We also work respectfully with the members of Congress across the whole political spectrum, and we welcome anybody who is serious about solving climate change to join us as a volunteer. And we're also so pleased to say that Dr. Hayhoe serves on our advisory board. So to learn more, please visit citizensclimatelobby.org after the presentation. And after Dr. Hayhoe speaks a bit, we'll have time for a Q&A. We'll be using Poll EV, which our speaker will explain in a moment. And we will be recording this session and sending out the link on Friday for you to review if you miss anything or want to rewatch it. And now I'll turn it back to Eric, who will introduce our special guest.
Thank you. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe is, in my humble opinion, and at this pivotal moment in history, one of the most important people in the world. She is an atmospheric scientist whose research focuses on understanding what climate change means for people and for the places in which they live. She is the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy and the Horn Distinguished Professor and Endowed Professor of Public Policy and Public Law at the Department of Political Science at Texas Tech University. Her list of appointments, advisory roles, and consultancies is far too long to present in the time we have, but we can start by noting that she has been named one of Time's 100 most influential people, a United Nations Champion of the Earth, an Oxfam Sister of the Planet, and the World Evangelical Alliance's Climate Ambassador. She is lead author of several of the National Climate Assessments and a reviewer on the Nobel Prize-winning International Panel on Climate Change. She hosts the PBS digital series Global Weirding, currently in its 5th season, and her new book, Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World, was released in September of 21. As Leah mentioned, she also serves on the advisory board of the Citizens Climate Lobby. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Katharine Hayhoe.
Thank you, Eric. It is so good to be with you all here today. Welcome, everyone. We are going to be talking about my new book, and if you haven't read it, don't worry. I'm going to tell you about it, why I wrote it, what it's about. I'm not going to spill too many beans, though. There's lots of good stories in the book. You have to read yourself to get it. And at the end, Eric and I are going to be taking your questions, and here's how we're going to be doing it. We're going to be collecting your questions via pollev.com/Katharine, my name. If you could just give me the permission to share my screen here, I'll put it up on the screen as well. The link is in the chat. If you're listening on Zoom here, just go to the chat. There's a link there. You can click on it. You will get something, if you're on your phone, you will get something that looks like this. If you're on your computer, it will look almost like this, except a bit bigger. And anytime throughout this whole talk, you can put in your questions. But here's the fun part. You can upvote the questions that you most want us to answer. All right, I have permission. Let me share my screen. Here we go. pollev.com, pollev.com/my name, which is Katharine, Katharine. So you can put your questions in at any time, and you can upvote the questions you most want us to answer, because typically we get way more questions than we can answer in the time. So you can look at all the different questions that other people put up, and then you can vote up the ones that you most want answered. Okay, I'll remind you again halfway through the presentation. So I wrote a new book. It just came out a couple of weeks ago called Saving Us. And actually today is the official release date in the UK and Europe. So today is actually the book's birthday, so to speak. But it came out in North America 3 weeks ago. Why did I call the book Saving Us? I called it Saving Us because so many books about climate change talk about saving the planet. Yet, it isn't about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we are gone. We are the ones who are most at risk. We are the ones who are not able to float around in outer space without the resources that this planet provides. We humans and many of the other living things on this planet, we are the ones at risk. The cockroaches and the mosquitoes and the planet will still be here. The question is, will we? Climate change affects us in profound ways that matter to every single one of us. Climate change affects how much water we have, when and where, and the quality of the water. It literally affects the air that we breathe, and everyone needs air to breathe. It affects the food that we eat, the nutritional content of the food, and the crop yields, and everybody needs food. And it affects our infrastructure, our buildings and our roads, and our water systems, and our power systems, our electricity systems. All of those systems were built for a planet that no longer exists. We designed them based on the conditions of the past rather than the future. Climate change affects all of us to such an extent that to care about it, we only have to be one thing. And that one thing is quite literally a human being living on this planet. And if you are listening to this, chances are that that's exactly what you are too. So, over the years, I have spoken to so many people. I've spoken to students at universities, to community groups, to business groups, to faith-based groups, to policy and government people. And wherever I go over the last 4 or 5 years, the number one question that I've been getting is this: what gives you hope? I get that question so often that is why I decided to write a book. Because I wanted to give people something that explained, where do we find hope? Because all too often, we place our hope in things that disappoint. And when we do so, we get discouraged and beaten down to the point where, for many people, hope almost seems like a dirty word. Where do we often place our hope where it will disappoint us? Well, often we either place it in the science or in the politics. We say, surely things will get better. Somebody will discover something that will fix this. The news can't be this bad all the time. Unfortunately, it can be. And it can even get worse. Whether it's wildfires in California, Greece, or Australia. Whether it's droughts in Madagascar, heat waves in British Columbia. And then just this past week, if you've been watching the news, California had the driest year in a century as of a week ago, and then record-breaking rainfalls a week later. Climate change is loading the weather dice against us, increasing the risk of these disasters. It used to be back in the 1980s that there was on average about 3 months between billion-dollar weather and climate disasters occurring somewhere in the US. So when one occurred, there'd be on average 3 months before another one occurred. You know how long it is now between billion-dollar weather and climate disasters in the United States? 18 days, not 3 months. So yes, things are definitely getting worse. And if we just hope that somehow science will fix this all by itself, it won't. What else do we often pin our hopes on? Politics. But when we look at politics, the situation truly is dire. Before COVID hit, just before COVID hit, the Pew Research Center asked people which issues they prioritize more. And it turns out that the biggest political polarization, the biggest differences between Democrats and Republicans, as evidenced by the width of the gray bar, the biggest difference was for what? Climate change. Climate change was the most politically polarized issue in the whole country. Well, then along came COVID. And where are we now? So look at these numbers. We have about 20% Republicans and about almost 80% Democrats. So from 20 to 80, right? This is where we are today. Addressing issues around race is now number 1, dealing with climate change is number 2, and dealing with the COVID outbreak is number 3. Why is climate change number 2? It's primarily because the Democrats went down. They went down from 80 to 60. That's why it's the second one instead of the first. When we place our hope in politics, even the really important bills that are being considered right now, the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better bill, those are potentially the biggest pieces of climate legislation being considered that are going to be considered this decade. They are very important, and I hope they pass. And I urge everybody who's listening, if you want to call your elected representative and say, yes, we do need these to pass, do that. But when we place our hope in a single person, a single president, a single elected official in politics to fix it, we're nearly always disappointed. It never lives up to what we think it should happen. And when we find out just how unfair climate change is, it gets even worse. Did you know that the poorest 50% of people in the world, the poorest 3.5 billion people in the world, produce only 7% of global emissions? 7%. And climate change disproportionately affects the poorest people. Women and children, especially in poor countries, indigenous communities, people in black and brown neighborhoods right here in the United States. When heavy rainfalls and hurricanes come, which neighborhoods flood first? Typically the lower income ones, because they're located in flood zones where other people didn't want to live. When heat waves hit an urban center, everybody suffers, but lower income neighborhoods that were historically redlined, which were racist practices of banking and insurance and mortgage practices, they don't have a lot of green space. They have a lot of concrete. And so because of that, those neighborhoods can be up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than more wealthy neighborhoods with lots of green areas. So climate change affects all of us, but it disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable people. So if that's what doesn't give me hope, each new disaster, the politics, and the injustice of climate change, what does give you hope? Let's talk about what that hope is first, though, because it is not imitating the metaphorical ostrich. It's not just burying our head in the sand and saying, oh, everything will be fine if I just wish it to be so. It's not cultivating an unrealistically optimistic perspective either. It is bad, and it is going to get worse. And so real hope begins by recognizing the risk and understanding what is truly at stake, not the planet, but rather civilization as we know it. I had a student ask me the other day, he said, I'm concerned that we might spend too much money trying to fix climate change and it might destroy the economy. I said, you're asking that question the wrong way around. Because if we don't fix climate change, it will destroy the economy. That is guaranteed. So it's not a case of, is this too much to spend? The question is rather, how much do you want to save or how much do you want to spend to save the economy? That's the question. Real hope accepts that success is not guaranteed, and it might not even be entirely probable. But there is the chance of success. There is that small bright light at the end of the tunnel. So we are not just running away from something bad. We are running towards something good. We are fighting to get to that better future, because that vision of a better future is what hope provides. And even the science offers a glimpse of this. How so? Well, this is a figure from the latest IPCC report, the Code Red report that came out in August. And what this shows is the observed warming of the planet. That's the black wiggly line there. And on the left-hand side, you have temperature. But on the bottom, you don't have years. You have carbon dioxide emissions from human activities. Why is that? Because we're the ones driving this change. It's not natural cycles, it's not volcanoes, it's not the sun. According to natural factors, we should be gradually, slowly cooling right now. Instead, we're warming faster and faster. Why? One reason: human emissions of heat-trapping gases. Digging up and burning coal and gas and oil produces heat-trapping gases. And they're building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. That's what's causing it to warm. Where's the hope here? The hope here lies in those colored shapes. What determines whether we end up in the green, the blue, the orange, the red, or the pink? Us. Our choices determine where we end up. Our future is literally in our hands. We have the agency, the ability to determine our future. It's not written in stone yet. And so the IPCC concludes, I think very powerfully, every action matters. Every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. We matter. You matter. What we do matters. Today more than any time at all. Katharine Wilkinson is helped to edit a wonderful book called All We Can Save, which is a compendium of women's voices on climate change. And in it, she said something that I think was so perfectly encapsulates what I was trying to share here, that rather than using my own words, I'm going to give you hers. And this is what she said. She said, "It is a magnificent time to be alive at a moment that matters so much. This is a moment that will be written about in the history books, if we have them, and it's up to us whether we do. We truly can make a difference, and that gives us hope." So how do we feel about things now? Well, as you might have heard, if you've ever heard me speak before, I talk a lot about how facts aren't what's needed to change people's opinions. The people who argue over the science, they're very loud, and I run into them all the time on social media. I think I ran into about 4 or 5 of them just today on Twitter alone. They're only a tiny fraction of the population, 7%. Only 7% are dismissive, just 7%. Yes, they're loud. Yes, they're in every online conversation. Yes, quite a few of them are in Washington, D.C., but they're only 7%. The vast majority of us are already worried about climate change. 70% of us are worried, but 50% of us feel helpless and we don't know where to start when it comes to climate action. That is the bigger problem we have. Not the 7% who won't shut up about how climate change is a hoax. The bigger problem we have is that half of us are worried and we don't know what to do. That's a bigger problem. There's even a word for this. It's called efficacy. Efficacy means, do you think that if you do something, you can make a difference? If we do something, can we make a difference? And today, our efficacy is abysmal. We have no sense that if we do anything, we can make a difference at all. We feel like we live in a system where a few people who hold all the power and wealth in the world make all the decisions, and nobody else can make anything change. That's how we feel. And so when it comes to climate action, the way we picture it is like this. We picture it like a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep cliff with only a few hands trying to push it up, and that boulder is not even budging. And if I add my hand and you add your hand and even all 98 of us add our hands, it won't move an inch. That's the way we picture climate action. Is it realistic? No, it actually is not. What's realistic? Well, when you look around and you see how the world is changing, and you see all the people who have their hands on the boulder, it becomes apparent that in fact, that giant boulder is not at the bottom of the cliff. It is already at the top of the hill. And in fact, that boulder is not standing still. It is already rolling down the hill in the right direction. And that boulder doesn't just have one set of hands on it. It has hundreds, thousands, millions of hands on it. I couldn't find a royalty-free picture that had millions of hands on the boulder. So if anybody's a good artist and wants to draw me one, I would use it. I want a picture of that boulder with millions of hands on it, pushing it down the hill. It isn't going fast enough, but when you add your hand to a moving boulder with millions of hands on it, it will go a tiny bit faster. And even more importantly, when you use your voice to advocate for change and to encourage others at your school or your university or your neighborhood or your town or your place of worship or your place where you work or the organization you're part of or the community group you're part of, the sports team you're part of, or the club you're part of, or whatever group you're part of. Your gardening circle, your knitting circle, your cooking circle, your PTA committee. When you encourage others through using your voice to advocate for change, to put their hand on that boulder, it goes even faster still. And when we look around, this is what's happening. Cities have climate action plans. 90% of new energy installed around the world last year was clean energy. We're still not quite where we need to be to meet the Paris targets. But you know what? When the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, we were looking at heading towards a 4-degree world. Now, promises are enough to keep warming to 2.7 degrees, and all the countries in the world are going to Glasgow next week, and I'm going too, to talk about how they can get it even lower. Action is happening, and when we look around, it is everywhere. Greta Thunberg puts this really well, and I feel like if anybody knows, she knows, right? She says the only thing we need more than hope is action. And remember, she was paralyzed with anxiety before she began to act. So she did everything she could to get her family to reduce their personal carbon footprint. And if that was all she had done, no one would know her name. But she did one more thing. And that one more thing that she did, a young girl, is exactly what each one of us can do to have the greatest impact on this world. She used her voice. In her case, she actually took a piece of white cardboard, and wrote a few words on it, "School Strike for Climate," and went and sat outside a building. That's how she used her voice. And she says the one thing we need more than hope is action, but once we start to act, hope is everywhere. Where do we start? All right, I want to add my hand to the boulder. Where do I start? Should I change my light bulbs? Should I get solar panels? Should I change my diet, eat more plants, less meat? Those are all good things to do, but they are not what makes the biggest difference. What makes the biggest difference is the thing that we are not doing. 86% of us are not doing this. What is this? It is, I have some maps to show you what it is. It's not agreeing that it's real. It turns out most of us agree it's real, right? And most of us are worried about it. This is a map of every county in the whole US, and you can actually zoom in on Pennsylvania, on West Virginia, on upstate New York. You can zoom in by county, and you can zoom in by congressional district to see what people in your area think. Most people agree, sure, it's happening. But what are we not doing? We are not talking about it. We're not talking about it. And if we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever do anything about it? So only 36% of us discuss it even occasionally, and only 14% of us have talked about it in the last week. Why not? We don't think it matters to us. We don't know how to communicate why it matters to others. And if they care about it, they should care about it for the same reason we do. And we don't think there's anything positive we can do to fix it. So the second most common question I get, and the second reason I wrote the book, is this: how do I talk about this to my relative, my neighbor, my old college roommate, my coworker, my colleague? How do I talk about this? Because climate changes and we get worried. If you're not worried, you have not looked at what is happening to this world and how it affects humans. There is every reason to be very worried. But then our human psychology kicks in. And we say, okay, I look around and nobody's doing anything. They need to be more worried. And so we load up all the scary looking facts that we can find. And believe me, there are plenty of completely 100% real, very scary facts. We load up all these scary facts and we dump them on people. We show them as much scary information as we can because we say, you need to be more worried. But now you know something. What do you know? 70% of people are already worried. And actually, you know what? I would put some money, some serious money, on at least 10 or 15% of the people who said they weren't. They actually are, but they're just shoving it down so far they're not willing to admit it. And if we're already shoving it down, or if we're already worried and we don't know what to do about it, what happens when somebody gives us even more reason to worry? We just reject it because our defense mechanisms kick in. I don't know what to do with this information, and I can't carry around this amorphous worry for days and weeks and months on end when there's nothing I can do about it. So we just shove it down, and inaction results. This is not just about climate change. This is literally how our human brains are wired. Let me say that again. This is how our brains are wired. And so when we do this to other people, here's what happens. In the words of a neuroscientist, Tali Sharot, she says, Fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. And so when we employ that with climate change, what happens? It just changes more. So how do we effectively communicate with people? If it isn't dumping more scary facts on them to get them more worried, what should we do? What we have to do is we have to address the two real problems. The real problem isn't that people don't know or they aren't worried. The problem is they don't understand how it matters to them here and now in ways that are concrete and relevant. We agree it matters to future generations and people who live far away and plants and animals. We don't understand how it matters to me living in Harrisburg with my family, doing my job, with my kids and my pets and my hobbies. How does it matter to me? We don't understand that. And we don't think we have the solutions we need to fix it. These are our two problems. So what do? This is what we talk about. We talk about why and how it matters to us. Not the polar bear, unless you are a polar bear. Not the Greenland ice sheet, unless you live in Greenland. I was asked the other day, how do you talk about polar bears in Iowa? And I said, you don't. You talk about corn. How do you talk about climate change in Pennsylvania? You don't. You talk about fruit crops. You talk about the river. You talk about the heat and the humidity. You talk about the crazy heavy rainfall events and the summer heat waves. Talk about what's happening where you live. But that's only half of it. Here's the other half. Talk about what we can do to fix it. Because remember, people feel no efficacy. Half of us feel helpless and hopeless. So what does that look like, talking about solutions? We can talk about what countries are doing. And stay tuned to the news, because with the big Glasgow conference coming up just next week, there will be a lot of stuff in the news about what different countries are doing. I love talking about what businesses and corporations are doing. Did you know that Apple's been 100% clean energy for, count that, 3.5 years? Did you know that there's a carpet company that makes carbon negative carpet, not just neutral? They actually figured out how to put carbon into the carpet tile. And so if you are, carpeting your office or redoing a big commercial space, you can actually make it carbon negative, not just neutral. That's amazing. Of course, churches and faith leaders are speaking out. The Pope, the Patriarch Bartholomew, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Muslim leaders, Hindu leaders, Buddhist leaders. I love talking about what states are doing. I have to put in provinces because I'm Canadian too, but I live in Texas. And I like talking about what's happening in Texas. Wind energy, solar energy, renewable energy, carbon neutral airports, cities like Houston and Dallas and San Antonio with climate action plans. You know what? There's a lot going on in Pennsylvania. A lot. There's a lot going on with cities. There's a lot going on at the state level. There's a lot going on with businesses. Find out what is happening where you live or whatever other state you live in and talk about it. People will be surprised. Every time I talk about this in Texas, nobody knows these things. I say we get 23% of our energy from wind energy, and people are like, really? I've seen a wind turbine. And I'm like, yeah, you've probably seen a few of them. That's 1/4 of our energy from wind energy. That's pretty high. So talk about what's happening. And I love talking about organizations like the one I work for now, which is the Nature Conservancy. They've got amazing nature-based solutions that green urban neighborhoods, that invest in smart agriculture, that protect coastal wetlands, that restore forests, clean up our air, clean up our water, provide habitat. Oh, and they store carbon too. Those are win-win-win-win solutions. And then there's this organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, which you may have heard of. And they provide every person with an opportunity to use their voice to talk about why it matters at the state level and at the federal level, to talk to your elected officials about how this affects you, your district, your state, and what they can do to make a difference for their people. Of course, the young people are raising their voices too, aren't they? And we can absolutely talk about them and the amazing example they provide of the power of a voice, right? We can also talk about how our own lives are changing. So people often want to argue, especially on social media. They say, is it individual changes or societal changes that are needed? And they will argue tooth and nail for one or the other. But you know what? I have an answer to that question. Is it individual choices or system-wide choices that will fix climate change? Yes. What do I mean by that? Well, a system is made of people. How does a system change when people change? So what's the most effective thing to do with our personal lives? Make changes. Change your diet. Recycle. Change your light bulbs. Get a plug-in car. Put solar panels on the roof if you can afford it. There's some really good loans, by the way. You don't have to buy them outright. But what do you want to do with that information? Talk about it. Talk about how you're reducing food waste. Talk about how you love not having to go to the gas station anymore during COVID times because you plug in your car. Talk about the new plant-based recipe you tried out and how delicious it was. Use your voice to talk about it, because we change each other's behavior and perspectives when we see and hear what other people are doing. I love talking about what's happening around the world. The world is changing. Remember I said 90% of new energy installed around the world last year was clean energy? Some of it in some of the lowest income countries in the world. They don't have coal or oil or gas, but they have a lot of sun and a lot of wind. And so lives are being changed by this new technology. So climate changes and you get worried. And you should be. I'm worried too. But here's where we break the cycle. Rather than loading up all the scary facts to make people even more worried and then ultimately paralyzed, what do we say next? We share why it matters to us here and now and where we live, and all the positive solutions there are, including the ones that they can do themselves to add their hand to that boulder. Join Citizens Climate Lobby. Reduce your food waste. Talk to your business about doing an energy audit or switching to clean energy. Use your voice to advocate for change, and you know what? People feel empowered, and change results. To go back to neuroscience, it says the human brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, not avoiding harm. So reframe your message so the information you provide induces hope, not dread. And what is hope tied to? Action. We have to show that there are a million hands on that boulder, rolling that boulder down the hill, and every one of us has a way to add our hand to that boulder, no matter who we are, no matter where we live, no matter how we vote, no matter what we care about. So at this point, I usually get two kind of skeptical questions. And now, don't forget, we're almost done here. Don't forget to add your questions to Poll EV. So Poll EV is open. It looks like we've got a bunch of good questions and some upvotes already. So the link is in the chat, pollev.com/Katharine. Add your questions here and we will be going to your questions in just a few minutes. But I want to address two common questions that often come up, because what I've said often sounds a bit too good to be true, doesn't it? If that's all it takes, why aren't we doing it more? And or someone else would say, talking, we don't need talking, we need action. Well, to that I would say, isn't talking an action? You have to choose to do it. And then you have to engage. In fact, sometimes talking can be harder than other actions, right? Does it work, and is it enough? So first of all, does it work? Well, we did an experiment after I wrote the book, so this is not in the book, where I participated in an experiment where we made 4 short videos, 1 minute each. And each video began with a value that typically appeals to Republican voters. So remember, what do? You share information about why it matters to them, to you. So these videos began by talking about personal liberties, a libertarian, or this is an Air Force general here who talked about climate change as a national security issue. Then Bob Inglis, who you're familiar with, he talked about how there's free market solutions to climate change. And I talked about climate change both from the perspective of being a scientist and a person of faith. So they took these 4 short videos and they aired them on social media in real life in 3 purple districts. Purple being, about equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats. They aired them in real life on social media, and guess what happened? They tracked Republican and Democrat opinions as people increasingly saw these videos and happened upon them on social media, and Democrats' opinions on climate change increased a bit. Good. They were seeing messages about climate change, so they got a bit more worried about it, a bit more aware. What happened to Republican opinions? They increased twice as much. Why? Because these messages began with what we had in common rather than what divides us. They began with values that those people shared. So in my book, I give dozens of examples on how we can begin conversations with whoever we are. Like what? Well, I'm going to ask you to actually try to do an inventory of yourself right now, okay? And I'll do mine to sort of show you. So first of all, where do you live? I live in Texas, which is one of the most vulnerable states in the country to climate change. We get stronger hurricanes, bigger droughts, more dangerous heat waves, and more heavy rainfall events. Also, I'm from Canada. And in Canada, we see sea level rising along our coast. We see wildfires burning greater area. We see permafrost thawing up north in the Arctic. What else are you? Well, I'm a mom. And I would do anything to ensure a better future for my child. In fact, that's why I co-founded an organization called Science Moms for moms who are worried about climate change. I love skiing. I love being outdoors in the snow. And guess what? The warmer it gets, the less snow we have. So I care about climate change because of that too. I garden. Climate change affects gardening. I knit. You can knit warming stripes patterns with one stripe for every year, and you can show the whole temperature history of the place where you live. And I'm a Christian. And I believe that we're supposed to be recognized by our love for others. And climate change affects the poorest and most marginalized people right here, as well as on the other side of the world. So that's why I care. And I start conversations with people over knitting, or over gardening, or over being a mom, or being a Christian, or over wine or beer, or loving beach vacations or tennis. In my book, I give dozens of examples of things that we can begin conversations with, and then connect the dots to climate change, and then show how there's positive, constructive solutions that anybody can get on board with. So yes, this works. But the second question is it enough? Well, talking by itself, of course not, right? If everybody just talked and never did anything else, then no. But talking is the catalyst. It is the catalyst that we often skip right over. So many people say to me, oh, I don't talk about it. And I say, why not? And they say, because everybody I know thinks the same way I do. And I said, well, first of all, how do you know that if you haven't talked about it? And then second of all, well, if they feel the same as you, but they're not doing anything, then shouldn't you be talking about it? Talking is the catalyst. It's like it knocks over the first domino in a long trail of dominoes. That's what talking does. And here's something really amazing I started to reflect on. And this is not from my book. This is from a Time magazine essay that I wrote after the book came out, just a couple of weeks ago. I started to reflect on history, and I realized something truly astounding. When you look at how our industrialized world has changed in the last 300 or 400 years in significant ways, what's the common denominator? The common denominator is ordinary people using their voice. Let me read you what I wrote to see what I mean. Change did not begin with the King of England deciding to end slavery, or the President of the United States giving women the vote, or the National Party of South Africa opting to end apartheid. It began when ordinary people, people of no particular power, wealth, or fame, decided that the world could and should be different. Who were the few people whose names we do know? William Wilberforce, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela. And who were all the countless other people whose names we don't know, who shared and supported and fought for their vision of a better world? They were people who had the courage of their convictions, who used their voices to advocate for the systemic societal changes needed. We ordinary people, we are the people who changed the world before, and we are the people who can change it again. And how does it begin? It begins by using your voice. What do you use your voice to do? To talk about why it matters and what we can do to fix it. And why are you doing this? Because it's not about saving the planet. It is quite literally about saving us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hayhoe. We do have questions coming in on the poll EV. Let me remind everyone to use the link to submit your questions and to vote on them. In deference to our audience, I'm going to go through these in order of their voting preference. Our first question is more of a comment, but perhaps we can turn it into a question by asking, what are your thoughts on the reconciliation framework that was released by the White House today? It does not contain a carbon price. Do you think it needs to, or can it get the job done by other means?
Well, first of all, I want to be clear that I support a price on carbon. But remember back to what I said about pinning our hopes on one specific politician or policy and making it a black or white, all or nothing game. At this point, anything is better than nothing. And we certainly have in this bill something that's a lot better than nothing. Could it be better? Yes, it could be a lot better. But does that mean that it's worse? We'd rather have nothing? No, we'd rather have something. So yes, we can keep on pushing. We can keep on calling your elected representatives and saying, this is what we need, reaching out to, the White House using links, letters. In fact, is there one that people can click to, through Citizens Climate Lobby to send in a letter or an email? Probably if you could, maybe Lisa could find one and put one in there. Absolutely keep doing it, because a price on carbon, it's something we have in Canada where I'm from. It's a very effective mechanism to spur innovation and development in a free market. It's got bipartisan support and even industry support. But just because a bill doesn't include it doesn't mean the bill is absolute chopped liver, so to speak. It can still accomplish something without it.
Do you anticipate a climate migration of people moving within the United States, or have you seen evidence of that occurring already?
At the large scale, not yet. In fact, a couple of years ago, researchers at Duke analyzed large-scale migration patterns in the US, and they found that people were still moving to Phoenix 5 or 6 years ago. And Phoenix is a place where it is so hot that one of my colleagues who lives there, one of my fellow science moms, last summer she had to wake up her kids before dawn so they could go outside and play before it got to be too hot. Another one of my colleagues who works at Arizona State University in Phoenix, she studies heat-related deaths. And so she got the data from the city, and she noticed that there was one full city block that was just dark red in terms of, lots and lots of reported heat-related emergencies and death. And she thought, that must be an error in the data. Like, why would it just be a block like that? So then she was driving to work, and she was just new. She had just moved to Phoenix pretty recently. She was driving to work, and she was using Google Maps. And on Google Maps, all of a sudden, she's like, oh, that's the rectangle that's dark red. The whole thing was mobile homes with all concrete and no trees. So remember I had talked about how low-income housing often has no grass, no lawn, no trees, and so it can be 15 degrees hotter than other parts of the same city? Well, in Phoenix, it's even more so. And so, unfortunately, Phoenix is one of the most vulnerable cities in the country, other than, a city right on sea level like Miami or New York. Phoenix is one of the most vulnerable interior cities in the country because of the heat and the water shortages to climate change. And people were still moving there as recently as 5 years ago. But we are starting to see that the United States actually has climate refugees. And they are Native American nations who live along the Gulf Coast of Louisiana and who live up in Alaska, who are having to move because of sea level rise and because of permafrost thaw. We're also seeing people starting to move out of California because of all the crazy wildfires and the smoke. And I know people, and you probably do too, have lost their homes. So we are seeing people starting to move for climate reasons, and I think this is going to turn into a flood. We have 700 million people around the world living in the low elevation coastal zone, including 2/3 of the world's biggest cities. Where will they go when sea level rises? That's why it's so important. Like I said, in the words of the IPCC, every year matters, every choice matters, every bit of warming matters. Because with every bit of warming, we can avoid a little bit of impacts, which means a little bit less suffering for people primarily who did very little to deserve it.
How can we use skyrocketing gas prices as a way to talk about climate? It seems like everyone I know is grumbling about gas prices.
Ooh, this is a great thing to do if we happen to have a fuel-efficient car, a hybrid car, or a plug-in car. Any of the above. And prices are going down, and you can get used ones too, of course. And so it's a great opportunity for you to say, first of all, sincerely, I'm so sorry. That is terrible. I can't believe how much it cost. Do you remember when it was $1.20 a gallon? And I actually remember that too. It kind of makes me feel old. But then you can also say, That's why I'm so glad that we have this. And you can take the opportunity to talk about how you have a car that is either very efficient, so it doesn't use a lot of gas, or it's hybrid, and especially if you have a plug-in, because then you can avoid going to the gas station altogether. I have a hybrid plug-in, so it uses the battery, and then it has a gas tank for when the battery's gone. But my battery takes me all around town, up to the university and back, and to the grocery store, and to my son's school and back. So I only have to go to the gas station about once a month, and I love it.
Aside from talking about climate change, what would you recommend to someone from an extremely low socioeconomic bracket to do in their lives?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, talking about it is one of the most important things we can do. It really is, and every single one of us can do that. But in a low-income bracket, often, we're just struggling to get food on the table, and to pay our power bills. So I would look for, and I'm not familiar with Pennsylvania, but I know this exists in other areas, and if anybody knows about it, put a link in the chat. There are nonprofits, like, for example, there's one that Andreas Karelis runs he wrote this great book called Climate Courage about climate solutions, where he helps nonprofits invest in solar energy. So there are nonprofits that help low-income neighborhoods invest in things like solar energy, or just insulating their home, or weatherproofing their home, or reducing their flood risk, or insulating themselves against damages. There are organizations that do this, and I would absolutely, if you can, find those resources in your community, in your state, and connect people who need them with those resources, because again, lower income people are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and they need more help than everybody else in just sort of preparing for the impacts, because they're more likely to be hit by them. Let me give you a tangible example. Here in Texas, we had a crazy winter storm last February. So crazy that I'm sure everybody heard about it, right? It was huge amounts of ice that took out the entire power grid. So everybody lost power, regardless of where you lived. But the people who lived in homes that were uninsulated, that had cracked windows, who couldn't afford a generator or a hotel room or anywhere to go, they were the people who suffered the most. And you know what? They were the neighborhoods that often got the power put on last. So wherever we are, people are suffering the most and need that assistance. And often that's a way to plug in our local community, make a difference. That's a way to actually act and talk without using words. How often you can, actions speak louder than words. It's a way to use your actions to show people that you care and they matter, and that climate change affects all of us. And there's a lot that we can do at the local level to help.
This writer asks, how can we convince others that climate change is real? I guess if you have the deniers in your immediate family, perhaps, who don't even believe that it exists, what's your approach to speaking with them?
Well, you definitely need to read my book, because my answer is you can't. You absolutely cannot. Let me show you this really helpful 6 Americas that I explain in my book. It's by the Yale Program on Climate Communication, and it's so helpful because often we assume people fall into 2 groups on climate change, them and us. But in reality, we fall into 6 groups, and the vast majority of us are worried. The vast majority. But at the far end of the spectrum, we have the 8%ers. The 8%ers, the dismissives, and that's a very good word for them, dismissive, they will dismiss 200 years of climate science. They will dismiss 2,000 climate scientists. They will dismiss 2 million scientific studies. So I was not being facetious when my answer is that you can't convince them, because they're determined not to be convinced. And literally, if 200 years of science, 2,000 scientists, and 2 million scientific studies won't convince them, what will? My personal definition of a dismissive is if an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone that say global warming is real and foot-high letters of flame appear to them, that wouldn't convince them. And so if that won't, nothing else will. So then you might say, so are you advocating giving up? Not at all, because they're only 8%. They're 8%. And you know what that means? 92% of us, we can have a constructive conversation with. How? Not by dumping a bunch of fear-laden facts on people, but by talking about why it matters to us in ways that are relevant here and now. And if you don't know what's relevant to somebody, ask them some questions and get to know them first. Figure out what makes them tick. I do that all the time, and within 5 minutes, I can always find something that I can connect to climate change with. Although it might be very unlikely, like they like to run outside, or they have a pet, or they love to fish. Connect the dots to why it matters and talk about a positive, constructive solution that they can be part of. 92% of us are not dismissive, and there we can absolutely have positive conversations.
How can we connect with people specifically here in the coal country?
Coal is something that we've been relying on for a long time for energy. And coal initially brought us into the industrial era. And I don't think it's out of place at all. And I actually have a Global Weirding episode that talks about this. The link to Global Weirding's in the chat there. The one about fossil fuels. I actually have a Global Weirding episode where I begin by saying, I am truly grateful for the benefits that fossil fuels have brought us. I would not like to be a woman living 300 years ago. I would have lived a very short and a very miserable life. I would have died long before my current age, probably as a child, and if not as a child, definitely when I had a baby. That would have been the end of me. And my days would have been filled with endless chores, drudgery, no opportunity for education or travel. I'm grateful for the Industrial Revolution. But we know now what we didn't know then, which is not only that heat-trapping gases are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet when we burn fossil fuels, but we also know that they're very dirty and very polluting. That when we burn coal, it produces pollutants that when people breathe it in, all told, with coal, gas, and oil, they're responsible for almost 9 million deaths a year prematurely. And you know what? In coal country, mountaintop removal coal mining is responsible for huge problems. Kidney disease, heart disease, premature births, cancers, all of those are caused by the toxins and the heavy metals leaching into the water supply. So often, I think, people who work in the industry feel demonized, and it's not their fault. They're just trying to feed their families. They're not making 6-figure, 7-figure salaries off this. They're just trying to put food on the table. And they want to be able to have a job in the future. And so that's why I think it's so important, the concept of a just transition, to talk about how else could we bring jobs here? Because you know what? The coal industry has been declining for 30 years, and it's not because of climate change and climate policy. It's because we have better ways to get energy today, including natural gas is cleaner and cheaper. And of course, wind and solar is much cleaner and much cheaper. But we have better ways of getting energy. And so coal country has been suffering already for years. So let's look to the future. What are some ways that we could bring new jobs in? How could we bring in manufacturing jobs? How could we bring in more blue-collar jobs and white-collar jobs? How could we attract more industry to these areas so people can still have the jobs they need to feed their families without being worried that the coal company that they work for is going to shut down, not because of climate policy, but just because it got, outpriced or outbid by a natural gas? So I think there's a lot we can do, but starting with compassion rather than judgment, I think is absolutely key.
How do we counter the argument that US action on climate change will allow China or another country to take advantage of us economically?
So this is the number one myth that I think is floating around the whole US today. And in fact, today, 6 oil executives or executives representing fossil fuel interests were testifying on the Hill. And again today, I wasn't watching it myself, but I was listening to commentary. People brought up the idea that somehow the United States is doing this awesome job tackling climate change and nobody else is doing anything. And the United States is going to fall behind economically because it's doing so much and nobody else is doing anything. And I'm just like, what are the facts on that one? There's a little theme going viral on TikTok right now where they put something up and they say citation needed, please. So that is a citation needed, please, because last time I checked, there were a lot of countries doing a lot more than the United States. So let me actually show you the statistics on that. It's called Climate Action Tracker. And just a second here. Countries, overview. Here we go. Share my screen. So the colors, green means doing awesome. Who's doing awesome? The Gambia. Yellow means almost sufficient. Yellow is holding warming to 2 degrees. Who's on that list? Costa Rica, Ethiopia, Kenya, Morocco, Nepal, Nigeria, and the United Kingdom. Then there's insufficient, and who's on that list? United States, along with South Africa, Peru, Norway, and more. So we see that there are a lot of countries who are already doing better than the United States. And even China made a brand new announcement today, and doesn't reflect it here. They only update this every once in a while. So there's other countries that are pulling up their socks. And what a lot of people don't know is that China has more wind and solar energy than any other country in the world, double that of the US. India is aiming to be the first country to decarbonize or to industrialize without depending solely on coal. So when the whole sort of straw man argument that the United States is doing everything and nobody else is doing anything, I'm just like, take a realistic view of the world. The United States is currently middle of the pack if the current legislation passes. But there's a lot of people still ahead of it, as well as people who can catch up and be inspired by what the US does, because we don't exist inside a set of walls. One country doesn't do something and nobody else does anything. The reason why solar is so cheap is because China, the government of China, invested in it and brought the price down. That's why solar is so cheap. And there's a really good little book that just came out called The Texas Power Plant That Saved the World. It talks all about how solar got cheap and now what's happening in Texas because of it. So there's this whole illusion that nobody's doing anything except us. It is a complete illusion. Every different part of the world is trying to do something. The real laggards are Russia, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, and Turkey. Those are the real laggards who are really doing nothing. Everybody else is trying and doing something. Of course they need to do more. But the United States is not alone. It's middle of the pack.
We are almost at time, so this may end up being our last question. But one writer asks, do you believe that we are past a certain point of making a true impact against climate change? I suppose, is it already baked in?
I don't believe it because I'm a scientist and that's what I study. So based on my analysis of what the future looks like, depending on the choices we make now in the next 10 years, I can tell you that the difference in our choices is this: the future of civilization. Will our children grow up in a place where water comes, or their children grow up in a place where water comes out of the tap, where there are geopolitical boundaries, where there is a safe place to live, where there is a healthy economy, or not? That is what is at stake, and it is not too late. It is not too late to save us. Of course, there's still some impacts that are here today. And there's still some impacts coming that can no longer be avoided tomorrow. It's as if we've been smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for years and even decades. We have impaired lung capacity, and we might even have some spots on our lungs. It's too late for that. But we don't have emphysema, we don't have lung cancer, and we're not dead yet. So when's the best time to stop smoking? As soon as possible. How much? As much as possible. Why? Because we're truly fighting not just to save our own lives, but that of everybody else on this planet. Thank you.
I'd like to say a hearty thank you to Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, as well as the members of her team who helped us organize tonight's event. Leah?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Hayhoe. It was just so great to have you. And I just wanted to quickly add that if anyone on here would like to check out Citizens Climate Lobby, we are actively working to support a price on carbon pollution. We have our fall national conference coming up. It's online, November 13th and 14th. And you can check out the link at citizensclimatelobby.org/climate-change-conferences. And we can share that link with you as well. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And I guess get out there and start talking.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Good night.